first to have, here it goes, to have a presentation on your experiences last year and what you learned, and also coming back to give us a little bit summary of where we started your contact with you in 2021. Vivek, on the programs, the longer, the more structural programs that you are working on, and I assume there's an overflow in your presentations that will come naturally. And then finally, we have asked Laurens Hondema from the GGD, the Public Health Service in Amsterdam, to explain where we are in developing Code Red as part of the discussion, also with this the participants of the webinar. If you have a question, please put it in the chat. But after each presentation, if there's something urgent, you can also raise your hand, and I hope I notice it and give you the floor. As said, this will be recorded. We send you the link and the report where Melanie, my colleague, will be working on, and the presentations afterwards. That will also be found on the website of Klimaatverbond Nederland. I will inform you. And my colleague Ethan has, in preparations of this webinar, also collected some documents and newsworthy items of what happened in Portland around the heat. So we also send that summary little file as included in the reporting of this webinar. Am I forgetting anything? All clear? Are we set? And we'd like to start with a little film picked from YouTube that says it all about how you prepared for 2022.
At 6, it's hard to believe given the current weather, but this time last year, we were preparing for that dangerous heat wave.
Yeah, in late June of 2021, Portland set all-time heat records, and it was so hot, roads buckled. At the time, we had no idea how deadly the heat wave would end up becoming.
This week, Multnomah County shared its plans to keep people safe next time the temperatures spike. Fox 12's Audrey Wheel joins us now live in studio with what's happening right now to prepare. Audrey?
Well, as we know, we don't have any hot temperatures in the forecast right now, but that's really the whole point, that county and city officials want to make sure everyone is ready long before we do see another heat wave. There's already outreach work happening as we speak. I tagged along with neighborhood volunteers this afternoon.
It was about this time last year that Portland soared well into the triple digits. More than 1,400 people in Multnomah County went to cooling centers over 5 nights. ERs and urgent cares saw 3 times the usual number of heat-related visits by year's end. And sadly, in the last week of June alone, 69 people in the county died because of the heat. Now county and city officials say they're putting in a lot of work to make sure that kind of tragedy doesn't happen again. A big part of that is outreach. The county and city identified 300 buildings in urban heat islands where people who are more vulnerable to the extreme temps live, and already started talking with them directly.
For me personally, it's because of seeing what happened last year and knowing even for myself, my neighbor was kind enough to loan me a little cooling unit. I don't have one in my house. I don't have air conditioning, and how hot it got. So it just definitely brings it home how critical it is.
Carlene McCabe is a neighborhood emergency team volunteer, passing out these flyers at a Home Forward building for disabled seniors.
It's totally voluntary. They could do a little survey kind of on how they're doing. They also, for people that are willing to, will install a temperature sensor in their unit, so it'll allow them to keep an eye on things.
Another new thing, the county now has 18 buildings that are smaller and in different locations to be used as cooling centers if needed, as opposed to the only 3 larger centers that opened last summer. They also have a new, bigger warehouse to store shelter supplies, and workers will be delivering things like cooling kits and fans to low-income families.
In 2 weeks, local governments and organizations will be putting on what they call Heat Week, which will be a week of heat-related events focused on safety, awareness, and climate discussions. Reporting live in studio, Audrey Wheel, Fox 12 Oregon.
That gives the first primary. Actually, this was about a year ago when we last talked, and we already mentioned this heat week you had. And actually, the first line is similar to here. It's raining, it's cold. There's nobody thinking about the heat. Similar, like you started your preparations in 2022 for what again became a very hot summer. We always have the confusion between Fahrenheit and Celsius. So Ethan, maybe you can put in the chat the differences. So while you talk on Fahrenheit, we can have a look at what it means in Celsius, so we don't get confused that you think you're all burned in hell when the numbers get high. Jonna, may I ask you to open your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Let me share screen. There. Does
Yep.
that? I think I'm sharing it full screen. Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Madeleine. So my name is Jonna Papaefthimiou, and I have the opportunity to talk to you this week when I'm actually between two jobs. So last week, I worked for the city of Portland. I was the Chief Resilience Officer for the city at the City Bureau of Emergency Management, which organizes emergency response. And I've been there about 10 years. And in fact, I was the interim director of that agency during the heat dome in 2021. I left that job last week. Vivek came to my going away party. And next week, I'm starting a new job for the governor of the state of Oregon. So I'll have a similar role, be the Chief Resilience Officer, but for the state rather than the city. So I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about what happened in 2021, the Portland scenario, which I think may be also familiar at this point to many of you. So I won't spend too much time on it, but it was really an unprecedented event for us. And then talk a bit about what we did in 2022 to prepare for what turned out to be, again, a really relentless heat that summer, and then bring it around to talk about some of the work that's ongoing. So to start with the heat dome in 2021, we had 3 record-setting days of heat. In June of 2021, there was nothing in our experience of climate in Oregon that really prepared us for that heat. And the fact that it happened in June, really in the first week of summer, made it, if possible, even worse, in that people hadn't gotten the air conditioner out of the garage and stuck it in the window, or people were not yet acclimated to the heat because it was so early in the season. We did have weather forecasts that told us it was going to be really hot, and so almost a week ahead, we started to make preparations for emergency response to heat. And based on what we knew then, we really focused on 2 things. One, on street outreach to people who are houseless. Portland has a population of about 6,500 people, and about 2,000 of those people are unhoused. People that live really on the street, like on the sidewalks and in tents. And so we knew they were faced grave risk for heat, and so we focused street outreach there with water and warnings that it was going to be hot. And then we prepared cooling centers, so places that people could come to get cool when it was very hot. So that happened, and then the heat hit. On Saturday, it was 108 degrees, and that was the highest recorded temperature ever in the city of Portland. So that was already broke the heat record by a degree. That record stood for 1 day. And then on Sunday, it got 4 degrees hotter. So after breaking the 150-year temperature record by 1 degree, we broke it by 4 degrees again the next day. And then unbelievably, the next day, we broke it again by 4 more degrees. So 116 Fahrenheit, how possible you in your mind figure out what that is in Celsius. It's just incredibly hot for us. So it's just, and I remember this so well. Monday night, the heat broke. I was working an overnight shift at the shelter that night because we were running out of volunteers. And when I went into the shelter, it was 116 degrees. And when I came out, the temperature had dropped 50 degrees, which is also just, that was another kind of temperature record, actually, the delta of dropping 50 degrees in the space of a few hours was phenomenal. But the heat was caused in part by climate change, but also was a meteorological phenomenon that's rare. So even with climate change, this was maybe a once in 500 year event, or, well, we don't really know, but that was the guess at this time. So it got so hot. what do we do while it was so hot? We opened indoor cooling centers, like they said in the video. We opened our convention center and park community centers. We served about 1,000 guests sleeping overnight on the busiest nights. And it was a mix of people who were houseless and also people who just had housing that was not, they were not able to keep cool, and particularly people who were older or people with very small infants that were concerned about the heat. So they slept in our cooling centers. We continue doing street outreach all the way through the heat using volunteers. A lot of volunteers came forward to help, and also mutual aid groups, churches, culturally specific organizations. It's funny, but I don't know if it makes sense in a different context, but in Portland, there were a lot of groups that were organizing around racial justice protests, interestingly, that were marching, and many of those groups also came forward and participated in mutual aid. So it was a really interesting mix of people that were doing street outreach. But we did that. We also, in a not tremendously systematic, we did phone outreach to apartment dwellers. So we called apartment owners that we knew had larger buildings, older buildings, and asked them to check on their residents. And if they said they needed help, then if they could give us a list of their residents, we found volunteers to call for it, to make those calls. We also asked apartment building owners to put an air conditioning unit in the lobby or the community room of their apartment to keep cool. If people didn't have cooling in their individual units, people could at least come down to the lobby. And that was easier than going across town to get to a cooling space. And then one volunteer group set up a misting station in a park, so that in a shaded area with water misting. And that was really popular. I'll talk a little more about that later, but that was an innovation. That was an idea that came from the community to set that up. So that was our response. It was it did not meet the need of the incident. It did not meet the moment. And I think underlying that were the majority of people in Portland do not have central air conditioning. More than half just don't have. They might have a window unit, but at least a third of people we think have no air conditioning at all. So that was fundamentally people were getting really hot. People knew that they were hot, but also because this heat was so rare, people didn't recognize that heat could be life-threatening emergency. People knew they were uncomfortable, but they did not believe their lives were at risk. Our experience of heat is generally, even when it's hot during the day, it cools off at night. And so I think many people believe, oh, if I can just make it through the day, I'll have some relief when the sun goes down. And that did not prove true. It stayed really hot and overnight. We were also just coming out of the pandemic. And so particularly people with underlying conditions or older, heat is hard on their bodies, but also those are the same groups that were at greater risk in the pandemic. And so coming to a cooling center or even apartment building lobby maybe seemed frightening. We're also trying to help people with rides, but we were disorganized in that. The phone system just basically got tangled up and hung up on people, got overwhelmed. And also we saw that residents who were at risk, in part, again, because they didn't recognize this as a life-threatening emergency, and people have underlying conditions, both mental health and physical health, that made them uneasy about interacting with others. So I know personally of at least one apartment building where the manager checked on people and someone said, "I'm fine, go away." And that person then passed away later that day, even though they were insisting that they didn't need help. This was heartbreaking. So those are also problems in our response. And then finally, our first responders were overwhelmed. Our calls to the 911 emergency response system just rocketed up 3 times higher than normal levels. Emergency departments were overwhelmed. Just everyone who could do emergency response was sprinting through the entire event. And even so, we had 69 deaths in our county, in the metropolitan area of Portland. And we also haven't talked a lot about this, but if we look at excess deaths, so the number of deaths from other causes, cardiac events and things that exceeded what would have been average for that week in past years, we saw about 160 excess deaths, which is that's about 3 times the number of deaths that we would have seen on the 3-day stretch, the summer before. So really, probably even 69 feels like really a failure of emergency response, and that's a massive undercount. So that happened. Our public health department did publish afterwards a long study that provided information about all the heat deaths, and what we saw that's probably very familiar to people that work in this realm, but living alone was a huge risk factor, underlying health conditions, either age or other health conditions. Nobody who passed away had a working air conditioner. And people died in single family homes, but we saw disproportionately people died in apartments and in manufactured homes, like mobile homes. So those were the risk factors. Also, we're very focused on the public health impacts, and I think that's the most we have to be. That's our human life is always our highest priority, but it's maybe worth acknowledging that even for folks whose lives were not at risk, there was a lot of impacts to the city. Our streetcars stopped running because the power lines, the overhead power pickup, when it gets hot, starts to sag. So it really screwed up our transit system. A lot of trains had to stop running just when people needed to, we would like people to stay out of their cars, or maybe people needed to get to a cooling center, the streetcar wasn't working. Also, we closed all our public pools on the second day because our lifeguards were getting heat stroke. So that was just like an asset that we thought we had was not at all useful. But you saw in the newspaper, the pavement buckled on Denver Avenue. That wasn't very good, and we can see more of that. Also, a lot of small businesses closed because they didn't have air conditioning either, and we saw heat stroke from people working in kitchens or working in other hot storefronts, and a lot of businesses had to close. So that was an economic impact for owners and workers. And then we're continuing to see, even now 2 years later, long-term damage to street trees. That they got burned in the heat and they're declining, and we'll probably continue to see tree death for years following, which of course is problematic also because trees are one of the things that cool the city. So when heat kills trees, then it's amplifying our heat problem. So after all that, how do we change our response for 2022? I think our biggest modification was we improved our communications because we realized that that people needed to recognize that heat was a life-threatening emergency, and we needed people to check on each other and help each other. There was just no way that in government we could do that. So you can see on the right some of the things that kind of messaging that we're using. Last summer and this summer, anyone can get sick from hot weather, heat stroke's a medical emergency, share what you know about heat. We also started using the wireless emergency alert system, which I'm sure there's something similar in the Netherlands, but it's a system that will like hit your mobile phone with a message. Like it looks like a text message, but you can't turn it off. You don't sign up for it. It just like sets off an alarm. It says extreme heat. You can see in the upper right a picture of the message we sent out. But so we pulled out all the stops on messaging. We also improved our transportation assistance, and we also our transit agency agreed to give free rides to everyone during a heat emergency. That was not a concession that came easily from them, I'm sorry to say. We had people that were turned away that were waiting outside in the extreme heat during the heat dome, and were turned away because they didn't have the correct fare for the bus or the max. And there was just such public outrage, I think rightly after that, a sense that that it was like, not letting someone on your lifeboat because they didn't have the right change, that people were drowning in a sea of heat, and we kind of threw them overboard for, not having $1 a quarter. So that is changed now, wonderfully. We also saw that all those community partners were so important when we weren't prepared, and that we needed to be more systematic in supporting our community partners. And we started doing small grants to non-government organizations to help them buy water or do other things for their own outreach. We set up a lot more misting stations because that one in the park was so popular. And we found that particularly for houseless folks who maybe have anxiety about using shelters or who've had bad experiences there in the past, we just have a lot of stuff. That coming to a misting station in a park where they can have their more familiar surroundings, be outside, have their stuff with them, that worked well. And also misting stations in a different context are great for families because kids can run around and be noisy, and adults can sit and be more cool. We also got way more systems. So that misting stations was something, and then more systematic residence checks. So the first year we just did whatever we could, but people didn't have phone lists together for residents. They weren't set up to do the calls in a systematic way. They were also just giving out people's phone numbers to basically strangers that volunteered to call them and ask them if we're okay, which met the needs of that moment. But really, like as a policy matter, it's not a great idea to give out lists of vulnerable residents and their addresses and phone numbers to other, whoever is willing to help. And so they got better about doing that in a systematic way with their own employees. And then we also bought some big commercial air conditioners and loaned them out to people that own apartment buildings, so they could set them up in their own lobby. So people who wanted to have a cooling space in their lobby could do that. So those are all things that we tried last year. This was in the news too. This is a project of Vivek and I and some other people, but we organized a memorial at the beginning of the summer for heat wave victims, which got some good media, and I think was good for mental health of us at least, hopefully others. But also it reminded people going into the summer season to think about the well-being of others and of the risks of heat. And then it was good that we did, because we didn't have that same heat dome, like that extreme 116-degree heat, but we had the longest heat wave in the history of Portland, the most days above 95 degrees in a row, and without a lot of nighttime cooling. So that unrelenting heat we saw last summer. And we had, I think, 8 heat deaths last summer over the course of the whole summer. So that still does not feel like we succeeded clearly in addressing heat. And that's just a direct death that we know about. That's not looking at excess deaths. So based on that, ongoing efforts, I always think we have to address the efforts kind of at 3. We have to think about what we can do now, like what can we do this summer, because climate change is upon us, and be working that emergency response efforts. But we also know that always being in emergency response mode is unsustainable. It doesn't meet the needs, and so we also have to think about what are our investments and our policies that are going to change over time. But in terms of our ongoing efforts just for emergency response and what we'll be doing again this summer, continuing the public education about heat, thinking about heat warning systems. I talked to someone who's promoting this sort of interesting idea of like naming heat waves, the way we name like hurricanes in the United States, and like thinking about them as like an incident in a different way that's like has a beginning and an end and is like a discrete emergency event, and warning people about it in that way. The neighbor to neighbor wellness checks are critical, because we'll just there's no other way to check on every person who faces risk. So creating systems or encouraging neighbors to create block captain type systems or floor captain systems to check on people is another approach. And we're giving away the city air conditioning units to at high risk residents. Some, not enough, but we have some. More commercial air conditioning loans, and then just expanding our network of cooling centers. So that's on the emergency response side. On the policy side, last year the state passed a right to cooling legislation that says people are allowed to put air conditioning units in their window. That might seem obvious, but a lot of apartment building owners don't often like that, because they feel it's a security risk, or if the air conditioner falls out, it could hurt someone and it'd be their fault. So that's, but now apartment building owners have to let people do that. That free transit.
Jonna, we don't hear you anymore. You're frozen. Right, I think the connection is lost. Yeah. I don't know if she realizes. How would she find out? Yeah. I'll send it. Ethan, can you send her a chat? I'm looking a little bit at Vivek. Maybe you can step in, because we lost Jonna.
Oh, so sorry. I don't. Oh, can you hear me?
Oh, no, now we hear you again. Sorry.
Oh, so sorry. I don't know what happened.
We lost
I'm
you.
terribly sorry.
It's a problem.
I'm so sorry. That was so strange. My internet just, I guess, disappeared. I'm almost done anyway, but I'll just say briefly, infrastructure investments to reduce heat islands. Also, I mean, compared to the Netherlands, okay, we're not that great, but in Portland, we're really proud that we, for bike transportation, Portland's doing relatively well for American city. And how do we keep that up through hot summers? I think is this idea of needing to have cool corridors, like just as we have like bike route maps, to have plans for how people can get through the city in ways that they won't get overheated. And then continuing to invest in public spaces, community centers, parks, places where people can stay cool. And then this is what Madeline and I were talking just before everyone jumped on, but this is maybe where I'm hoping to see us stretch in the future. But he has tremendous impacts on mental health, and can exacerbate underlying mental health conditions, make them worse, and also that people have a lot of grief around climate change. So there's a lot, I think, to be done in the realm of mental health and heat, and we're just starting to work on that. Also, Vivek and I have been talking about this one a lot. There are cultures that have an experience of heat that's long. You know, cities in the Middle East, huge cities that have tremendous heat and have cultural adaptations, like maybe businesses, those small businesses that can't operate in the heat of the day, they close, but then they open again at night. And it's funny because those adaptations are just totally free, and could happen quickly. They're much easier than like growing in urban forest that could take a long time. But they're almost the hardest ones because it means sort of changing our way of thinking about ourselves, and that's hard for people, right? It's changing business hours, for instance, but cultural adaptations. And then finally, maybe it's almost too obvious for this group, but I always want to just close with thinking that we also benefit by connecting it to other social justice issues, because social inequality is really it means that heat harms underserved communities most. They're always at the front lines of climate change. And even the fact that heat is the greatest killer, and yet of all natural disasters, more than floods, more than tornadoes or hurricanes, and yet it's the response that we're least planned for, reflects the lack of concern about the people that face the greatest risks. And so we really have to keep lifting up that issue. And that I'll just close with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonna. And as said, your presentation will be shared afterwards to this group, and wider will be put on our agenda. So many things that you have learned and already applied within a year. That must have been a major effort to do within a year. It almost looks like a continuous emergency. Or how did the organization work to set it? I mean, so because you tell us the outputs, but how did the process go?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it's always a coalition of the willing, so it's a collaboration between the city, the county, Vivek and others at the university. It's us calling up, we were saying before, like me calling up people in Seattle and saying, like, what are you doing for heat this summer? Like, what are your plans? Or people from Spokane calling me and saying, like, so it's this network of practitioners that are sharing information, but it feels very still loose, I would say. And also in emergency, I worked in emergency management, so we're accustomed to really focusing on an issue, and like we're bad at sort of long range work, but we're good in emergency response. And so I think that's where the strength has been, is like we can pivot and say, like, okay, we're just all about heat all summer long. But I don't think we're making as quick progress on things that require more sustained investment, like diminishing heat islands and doing tree planting. Like that is progressing more slowly, just because the practitioners there are less accustomed to having to pivot and respond to different emergencies all the time.
But because we're looking at how you mingle and connect the short-term response to longer-term impacts and vice versa. Yeah. And I'm particularly interested, and people in the call, please add in the chat if you have additional questions. But as long as you don't, I go on. This check on your neighbors, because that's the awareness we have as well. We say it in general, take care of each other, but this is more a specific action. And you said a little bit more, but maybe you can elaborate, because we deal with privacy, trust issues, and particularly for the most vulnerable people. What is your experience? Are people comfortable with that public call to do this, or is it complicated? Can you tell a little bit more about how this works?
Oh, that's a great question. No, I think it is complicated. I mean, kind of, I would say how we try to talk about it is like everybody knows somebody that they care about, or everybody has somebody that's their person. Or if they don't, that we would like to encourage them to think of someone, whether it's a neighbor or an old past coworker, someone from church, someone in your family, but think about someone that that might, and make a commitment to just check on that person, and in that way to hope that everyone gets checked. So that's one way. That's kind of the easiest way, because it's saying, like, we don't want to get in your business. You know who your person is. You go check on them. That works somewhat. And then the other way is this person that you showed in the news, like Carleen McCabe. So we have a system of volunteers in Portland. We have that's neighborhood based, and that's people who are active in, they don't know everybody, but are active in their neighborhood, are kind of thought leaders, or like, you know, the busybodies, probably some of them, like, but people in their neighborhood that know a lot of people. And so we ask them to help us organize more systematic checks. And likewise in apartment buildings, like the kind of floor captain, like, that knows people. But always the approach has to be that it needs to be, it's people checking on someone that they know, right? Whether it's because they live in your neighborhood, or they live in your building, or you're connected to them in some way. Because you're exactly right, like government workers coming and knocking on your door, there's not enough of us, but even so, like, there's not trust in government, that is an effective approach.
And did it work? How do you monitor that kind of call? And
no, it's a great question. No, because you averted deaths, right? Like, we can't count those. Like, if I might have, you know, had a really hard time, but my neighbor checked on me and helped me. How do we metrics for that? I don't have data. I don't have good data yet, but the city does a citywide survey every year, or no, it's not a lie, every 2 years, and say, and I got to sort of lobby them to add 2 questions to the survey. It's like a customer satisfaction survey for local government. Like, are you happy with your water service? And do you trust the police? And we ask a lot of questions. So we ask, but do you have someone who would check on you in an emergency? And is there someone that you would check on? And so we asked that question to everyone this year, and I don't have the data back yet, and we'll ask it again in 2 years. But so over time, we will get a metric of not did you do it, but like, at least in your own mind, like, are you planning to do it is the question. So we'll hopefully see that number go. We'll know if our efforts are working, if the number goes up over time.
Interesting, because we have the discussion or the assumption that social isolation is one of the main risks in a heat wave, and we have large programs on social isolation because it's a risk for many issues, well, health in general, and we consider it as unhealthy as smoking to be in social isolation. And our assumption is that to check on each other during an emergency like a heat wave also would have a benefit after the crisis, that
Totally.
it's easier to connect. Is that something you study? Because then you
we haven't studied it. No, but I think it makes total sense. I mean, and that's why it's well, just again, coming from my context in emergency response, like we would say, our best strategies are all hazard strategies, right? So this doesn't just work for heat waves, and that's absolutely true. If like we reduce social isolation, or people have a buddy, a neighbor, a partner, someone that checks on them, heat, power outages, extreme cold, wildfire smoke, like many other hazards, still having that person to check on you would be of great benefit. And then I always think of it as like, even if we don't have a widespread emergency, everyone has their own personal catastrophes, right? Like, your car breaks down and you can't get home to pick up your kids for school, and now know they're home alone, whatever. Or, you know, you lose your job, or you get sick and you whatever, and you need help. And so when we nurture those networks, I think when we're most successful, then they're mutually reinforcing strategies. People help each other through all different kinds of things, and it reduces social isolation.
Yeah, thank you. In the meantime, I'm looking at the chats. Caroline, you have a question. Can you open your line and raise it?
Hello, yes, thank you so much. Super interesting to hear all this information. I had more a question related specifically to the policies. I would be super interested to read if there is any sort of document explaining these sort of incentives that are in place, or I know the efforts are probably ongoing, or what you mentioned, like new building copes and this type of thing. Any links?
For sure, yeah, I'd be happy to send you some links for legislation at the state level, and then what we're working on or have been working on at the city.
Amazing, thank you so much.
We're all interested. Bring it on, and we put it in the notes of the webinar. Great, thank you for the question, Carolina. And then there's True 11109. Who is that? About the air conditioning question from the heat transfer from inside to outside. Who raised that question? Anyway, then I'll read it out. Do air conditioners transfer heat from inside to the outdoors? Then the city would not cool down that much. Do you have an idea if this is the case in Portland, by instance? Some want to ban these systems, maybe only for individuals in the Netherlands.
Shall we ask his feedback later on? Yeah. I mean, does air conditioning heat up the outside of the city? I don't think that in the probably a tiny bit, like that's how they work, right? They blow the hot air out, but I don't. On the net, I think there are other drivers of heat, or that it's dwarfed by other impacts to heat. So I wouldn't be worried about air conditioners making the rest of the outside too hot. We do worry about crashing the power grid because if everyone turned on the air conditioner at once, then it could overwhelm the grid. And even for older buildings, if many apartment buildings all plug in air conditioning at once, it can stress the electrical system in the building and you turn off the power in the building. So we have to be careful about that. But that's more of a risk than just making the city hot.
So the use of air conditioning itself is not.
No, it's not heating up the city.
Not an issue. It's not an issue in the public debate. It is in the Netherlands, by the way. So that's why questions around air conditioning.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah. It's very much seen as an unwanted development. But still, now one out of 5 households do have an air conditioning. We have no policy on airco, so it's they're there because of more heat. But it's interesting to hear there's not a public debate on aircos in your city.
Yeah, I mean, I think the technology is going to improve there too. So we use a lot of heat pumps now. It's not really an air conditioner, but it's a heat pump. The technology is somewhat different. It uses less energy.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Then Elizabeth Beckering, your question. Can you raise it yourself?
Yes, I was wondering about the misting stations you mentioned, which seems like a very good solution to cooling down individuals. However, in the Netherlands, we are starting to deal with droughts as well, combined with heat waves. And then we're starting to have to ration the water usage. Do you also have experience in Portland with rationing water usage? And if so, how do you combine that with measures such as misting stations?
That's a great question.
I would like to ask another issue that was raised in Rotterdam. They are against misting station because of salmonella risk. An issue in Portland. So those two questions combined, maybe. Yeah.
Oh, let's see, questions combined. So first on the drought, the state of Oregon and Portland do experience drought. That's why we see tree death. But in terms of our water supply, I have to give credit to the founders of our city. Long ago, they bought a very big area of land called the Bull Run, and they own the entire thing, and it rains a lot there. Because of climate change, we're getting more rain in the winter. It stores water in the groundwater, and then water flows out of Bull Run, and it provides the water to the city. And so we actually, even under our sort of more extreme climate change projections and population growth projections, because we're getting more rain in the winter, we don't see ourselves as having to limit water supply, like having limited water supply or needing to ration water in Portland in the summer. We also have a backup water supply from the Columbia River, which is the second largest river in North America, and not overtaxed for irrigation, unlike some others like the Colorado. So we don't. So thanks for people planning 150 years ago. We're not going to run out of water. So that might be a risk. But I would say misting stations also don't use a ton of water. It's not like a sprinkler uses a lot of water. A misting station is like very fine. And so compared to other things we might be doing, like watering landscapes, I think misting probably doesn't use a ton of water. Salmonella certainly exists here in Portland, and but I think there's the water we're using is chlorinated. If the system's maintained, I think it's pretty. It can be pretty safe. I can imagine if you kind of let it sit. I'll say ours are ones we pop up and then we take back and we sanitize and we store and then we set them up again in the heat. I can maybe see if you had something permanently installed, like in a park, and it didn't have the regular maintenance, that could become a risk. But we haven't. Ours are of a design that doesn't perhaps share that risk.
Last question on this round is from Patrick Klaassen. Patrick, can you raise your question, please?
Yes, of course. I'm very interested in your communication campaign. It seems very elaborate, and that you took extra actions to educate the public and raise awareness. But do you see any effect of that? How is it received by the public? Do you see that they take more action out of their own initiative? Because here in the Netherlands, we focus a lot of communications too. We're looking at different strategies, how we can better our communications and actions in that part. So I'm curious, how did it go? And
oh, that's a great question. And I'll share some links in the chat because I haven't even shown, we've done a lot. I haven't even shared everything we've done on communications. I want to show you because we have cool art and stuff, and I want to see what you're using. But I guess I would say on communications, one, you touched on the problem we kind of talked about before. It's hard to measure the effectiveness because if someone does check on their neighbor, they take action. Like there's not a systematic way to track that. So we are doing these public opinion polls over time that I hope will show an increase in that. But anecdotally, we hear stories like, oh, I helped this person or I checked on them, but it's right now we don't have a lot of great data. I think we've also had to adjust our thinking about it a little bit. We started out, and this may be too simplistic. Like we thought, like, oh, we have to tell that person that could die of the heat, like, hey, you're gonna die of the heat, like. We thought that was our target audience. And then we realized that person has got underlying health conditions. They're an elder. They're home. Like that person is not listening to us. That is why they're having risk. So we had to sort of adjust it to say, we're talking to the person who knows that person, right? Like we're talking to an audience of people who are caregivers, of moms, of good daughters, of friendly neighbors, of, like engaged residents, and saying like that's our audience. And so, and so we kind of reoriented our campaign towards those people. But a lot of those people are also really snarky too, though, right? Like if you look in social media, then they're like, well, thanks for telling me it's hot out. I knew that, So we don't get a lot of love back, right? Because like when we sent out this alert on the phone, which I'm sure saved lives, like the response was like, you scared my cat. I hate this sound. Why did you text me to tell me it's hot out? I know it's hot out. Like we did get a lot of positive feedback, and so that was a little hard for our elected at first. Like they don't like getting those angry calls. Stop it. But I think we just have to recognize that the people that are in the center of our concern are never going to be like, thanks for doing this for me. And so we just tell it. We have to acknowledge that at the beginning that we're going to get some of that and kind of just accept that is worth it. Yeah. I'm curious if you get the same, no,
it's interesting you say it, because we had the problem in the beginning when we had the national heat plan. It was particularly just 65-year-olds who got very annoyed that why do we need the government to tell me that I need to drink? And they thought it was totally patronizing. And we really were hampered in developing heat plans because of this image around it. And we even had a national cabaret around the national heat plan, totally killed because it was two simple messages then conveyed by the government. But now, because of the heat risks that we are facing, it's changing slightly. But still we see, and I said, darling, it's not meant for you when you're 65 and you're happy. It's meant for someone even older or more vulnerable, but it's difficult to communicate that.
So I think that Dutch people are very stubborn, but it's good to hear that
people are totally stubborn. But honestly, we speculated that stubbornness, like a long lived experience of climate is hard. It's a risk factor, right? Because you're like, people don't die of the heat. I've lived here 80 years. I've never seen anybody die of the heat. Oh, 70 people died of the heat. So that sense of knowing the climate, but the climate's changing, that I think it's totally a risk factor. And I'll just say this because these are my people. This stereotyping that I say, so this old white man, they're like, get off the lawn, you dang kids, you get away. Those are the people that are dying of the heat because they think they don't need anybody's help. So it's like, how do you reach the person? Like their biggest risk factor is that they want to tell you to screw off.
That was a very valuable lesson learned already, that the target groups, that you change your target groups, that people that are the surroundings of the people are most focus on them. Maybe that's a lesson learned that we can take with us and try to do something with in the Netherlands.
Yeah, focusing on the caregivers. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We're running totally out of time, but that's because there's so much. No, it's no complaint at all. And we just go on and on until we think it's finished. And that's the nice thing about webinars. We can close when we want. We don't have a room to empty because the next one is standing in line. But still, I think we should round up your part of your experience and ask Vivek Shandas, professor of the Portland University, to tell us where you are in the lessons from Portland 2021, 2022, and it takes the long-term or structural approach to heat risks in Portland, and maybe wider in the community of the US or Northwest US, as we said, Jonna.
Sure. Thank you, Madeline, and thank you for the opportunity to follow. It's always hard to follow Jonna because in part I'm trying to figure out, the connections here and want to create a coherent storyline and narrative for you to follow. So I'll just say that, again, Vivek Shandas, he, him, his, and I'm presenting from Portland, Oregon today, where we have an unprecedented earliest number of 4 days above 34 Celsius. That's going to start on Saturday this week. So this is the earliest. I've taken this back to 1938, and we haven't had a 4-day stretch of above 34 degrees in the history of Portland, at least going back to 1938. So we're presenting at a very opportune time because we are now experiencing these earlier summers, longer summers, and my allergies usually make me blow my nose in mid-June, and I'm very clearly now very allergic even now in mid-May. So we're seeing a lot of these very personal impacts, both to our health and my own experience of having worked on this issue and seeing all the ecological, for example, the tree canopy and what have you blooming much earlier. And so I just will share with you just a few of the things I've been working on since the heat dome. I'll share a screen since I put a few slides together, and I'll try to be fast with this, but I'm happy to put some links in the chat and follow up. I hope you can follow along. I'm a professor at Portland State University, and I'm owner and advisor of a consultancy, a climate consultancy named Kappa Strategies, which I'll talk about as well. It's been my response to being able to mainly sleep at night, knowing that the world is on fire, and I want to find multiple ways of addressing these issues. So just to really start off quickly, United States, not unfamiliar with heat. There were almost 1,000 people that died in Chicago in 1995. This was well before the conversation was happening about climate change, at least in the mainstream context. And it's definitely a time where we were recognizing the challenges in terms of trying to support communities with these intense and kind of discriminating heat events that fall on cities. And exactly 26 years later, as you heard, this was something that landed in Portland and the Pacific Northwest. And I want to just maybe follow on with what Jonna, or I like Jonna a lot more. I'm going to start calling her Jonna because it's the Dutch way of calling her. And Jonna's presentation talked about kind of what we're responding to in the current moment. I just want to go back, continue this historical approach of thinking about what we knew before going into 2021. And we had extensive academic research on localized impacts. In fact, this is a map I created in 2016. First map was created in 2009 of heat distribution at a very granular level. This is 1 meter resolution heat distribution across the city of Portland, and looking at the coolest places in blue, the warmest places in red, and really identifying places where the emergence of social vulnerabilities and physical amplification of temperatures coalesce and come together and potentially create greater mortality risk in the city. And we did this in 2009, 2014, again in 2016 with practitioners, with community members, and talking about it. And one of my moments of reckoning is simply seeing that people were saying, oh, this is a temperate climate, this won't happen here, we're okay, right? And so that was what I heard pretty much the last decade and a half of, we have other priorities. And so this was what we went into 2021 already knowing. And what I might suggest is that, we really need to think about this not just as Jonna was saying, not just as a government response, but as a collective, private, public, community, tribal. It's a very broad scale response to this. And at least in the United States context, no government agency is going to be able to get in front of this massive, intense, and again, discriminating system of heat deaths. And so the autopsy that came out in the medical examiner's office the data from the medical examiner's office, we were able to get that to essentially show where the deaths occurred. The darker colors here in this map show where the deaths occurred. And these red lines were what I had noted earlier in 2016 as where those deaths would occur. And while their deaths were far more extensive than we anticipated, they still followed a lot of the kind of social vulnerability measures that we had. Not hyper exact, but nevertheless very predictable in terms of what we were able to identify before. Following this heat dome, I wrote an opinion piece in our Oregonian calling for a variety of changes in the structural dimensions of how we go about addressing heat waves, talking about everything from outdoor worker safety to the role that air conditioning plays. I'll put this link in the chat in a minute. And many of the responses that I got from writing this were really surprising to me. There were community members that were saying, and this may be fringe folks on the fringe, but they were saying, we can't keep outdoor workers from working because I received about a handful of these. We can't stop them because that'll stop our economy, and we need economic growth at all means. So outdoor farm workers or roofers or landscapers, we need them working throughout the heat event. So there's some consternation there as a result of this work. We produced some data as well on Portland looking at what happened prior to, we talk about trees and greening a lot with heat as shading and evapotranspiration can cool. So greening is a big solution, which I'll talk about in a minute. Though what we found in an analysis of the changes in green space in Portland were essentially the same places that had some of the highest mortalities were also the places where we saw the greatest decline in green space and trees, particularly large trees in the city. And so this was starting to tell a story for me that these areas that are seeing greater vulnerability, greater impacts, are also the places where we're seeing many different changes, including landscape changes such as loss of tree canopy. And so the story gets a little bit more rich in this regard. This is not surprising. This is work that's being done on a national level. Just so you have an idea, the 90th percentile, we're seeing a continuous increase in the number of heat days. So this, not just my experience of what my allergies tell me with my body in terms of earlier summer and allergy season, it's also statistically relevant in terms of looking at the data going back 50 plus years. And so from a structural point of view, as Jonna already got to, the focus on tree planting, the city just invested $40 million into shade, and it was really argued, as I saw it from a narrative point of view, it was argued around a focus on shade equity and trying to get more trees. While trees are going to cool our environment, there's going to be several other strategies. So the state passed a law to put $10 million on the table for heat pumps and air conditioning units to be distributed to vulnerable and qualifying individuals and households deemed generally higher vulnerable communities. And that was something that really has been taking a lot of momentum. In fact, that started last year, and we're seeing more and more households receive these air conditioning units as well as heat pumps as a way for cooling, which brings up a lot of questions, including what Jonna had mentioned about the electrical grid capacity to manage that. Outdoor worker safety, I mentioned earlier, and Jonna also talked about cooling centers and community communication. It's not communication systems. And so part of the learning that I kind of leave this moment with after almost 2 years since the heat dome is that political priorities of moving these structural changes are helpful, but certainly not enough. So the question begs, like, what else can we do? And because I'd been working on this for so long, I actually, with a group of colleagues, started this secondary enterprise, which is trying to really support the agile, much more nimble work that often universities might be more challenged in doing, but a consultancy can respond much more quickly to. So I've worked with a series of several colleagues, and we've come up with this kind of way of thinking about climate adaptation, planning, and using data to inform some of the ways in which we consider interventions. And so we really want to ground this in a series of strategies where we know which stakeholders are involved. We generate these heat maps through hazard assessments. We're really leading to intervention strategies and implementation guidance. And so that's where we are headed with this work, in terms of trying to create a full circle of all the different community as well as built infrastructure, as well as intervention opportunities, and working with federal, state, nonprofit, research universities, and all hazards. Nevertheless, heat gives us a pathway to be able to get at some of this. So some examples of projects we've been working on. This is one that is often coming to mind. This is Portland General Electric is our regional energy utility. And we worked with them to get very granular data on indoor, outdoor temperatures, as well as energy use. So they have an enormous amount of data that at the household level that we were able to look at. So this, for example, is outdoor temperatures in relation to, and the 60 to 110 Fahrenheit translates to about 15 degrees Celsius to about 43 degrees Celsius, just so you know, on the right side of this graph. And we see that energy use really tracks very closely to outdoor temperatures. And this is during the heat dome period, from preceding the heat dome until the heat dome kind of subsided as well. We've looked at multiple heat waves using these data. We also have started to look at kind of differences in terms of income. So these graphs represent, in a very similar way, those who are at the top 30th percentile of median household income. That's what MHI means. And the bottom median household income for the Portland metro region. And this is a very clear signal to us that this energy use is playing out very clearly by income. We've also looked at this in terms of age, in terms of tree canopy surrounding the household. We've looked at it in a variety of different analytical lenses to understand what are the factors driving this energy use locally. Because what we have now in the Portland area, like you in the Netherlands, we have, when I first arrived in Portland in 1995, and then later in 2005, we had about a 25% air conditioning, what we call air conditioning penetration. So the amount of air conditioning that are in households or residences was about 25%. So similar to you today, it sounds like, though today we're upwards of 65 to 70%. So this transition happened in the last 5 years. And this is really playing out in very different ways. Lower income communities, less so, higher income communities, pretty consistently using AC. One project I was very excited to work on with Jonna on, this was a Portland Bureau of Emergency Management project where we were able to go to public housing, working with the public housing provider manager here in the city, and we put in indoor temperature monitors that would actually inform the resident when temperatures were getting above, in many ways, 30 degrees Celsius, 32 degrees Celsius, 35 degrees Celsius, etc. And we were able to actually notice that several different aspects. I mean, residents were consistently experiencing very high temperatures in their homes. The outdoor temperature varied quite a bit, but the indoor temperature kind of only bounced up and down a little bit. We were able to get individual units. So we were getting an exposure at the individual unit level, which is extraordinary data for trying to understand the effectiveness of air conditioning. We also found that there were households, residences, apartment buildings, residences that had air conditioning and those that didn't, and their apartments did not vary very much in terms of temperature. And there were a lot of strategies that residents were using to cool themselves, to cool the resident, to cool the actual space, as opposed to just turning on an AC. Because we know an air conditioning unit can also has a upper threshold limit to how much it can actually cool an indoor space, especially when there are these small units that are being put in. And that was a big part of our workshops. We did workshops with residents in these buildings, which are really interesting. We conducted surveys of how do people keep their homes cool. Now recall that these are public housing, like these are folks who are on the lower than 30% median household income, if not at the very bottom of the income bracket for the city. So we're really trying to engage those communities that are particularly vulnerable to the heat intervention, at least what we've seen from the results of previous heat waves. So many folks were saying fans were their primary focus, limiting use of stoves or other things that might heat up the environment. Common practice of opening windows at night. That's something Portlanders have done for a very long time, is just open the windows at night and close them. This of course brings up challenges when it comes to air pollution. If you open a window and there's a wildfire, we see lots of challenges with that. Though we have a whole report, happy to put the link of that report in the chat as well afterwards. This was the Oregonian report afterwards, which focused on one aspect of this. It says, study after deadly Portland heat dome shows air conditioners not the sole answer in public housing, which is interesting framing of this, because there is a contention in the Pacific Northwest and Portland specifically that air conditioners are not the answer that we necessarily want to completely embrace. And that is something that's now being talked about in public news media. So what are we doing then? So one of the things I'm spending a lot of time on, and this is just a way of trying to figure out, we're throwing a lot of resources. That's one thing I'm learning a lot. Like when a heat event like this happens, a lot of money materializes. And I've been working on heat for a long time, and I've been going around begging the federal agencies, local agencies for doing this heat work, and no one was interested. But all of a sudden, people are materializing resources to focus on this. So one of the things I've learned is that these events really catalyze and marshal resources, which is not a surprise and not really profound understanding. Nevertheless, the focus on resources is trying to think about multiple intervention strategies. Yet what we're really trying to suggest is that these intervention strategies are not one size fits all kinds of approaches. They really need to be place-based, understanding that household, that approach. How do we work with the community and think about different scenarios, 5-day heat waves, 2-week heat waves? What would those look like? How would people's adaptation strategies vary as a result of these different scenarios? And how might we use modeling and other techniques to help inform the strategies? We're building a bunch of tools as well. Since this heat wave, we're looking at greening has come up over and over and over. And so this is a little tool called Growing Shade that we built to try to think about identifying specific, very surgically precise urban forestry. That's kind of what I consider it, where we're thinking about individual little tree wells on a sidewalk, whether there's opportunity to shade in those locations. What are the socio-demographic conditions in those places where we want to be thinking about interventions? And so these decision support tools are really starting to make their way into different strategies. We've done a bunch of modeling and different other strategies to evaluate interventions. So this is trying to think about not just the greening, but we also want to think about various other financial or technical assistance strategies, job training approaches, emergency response, and really trying to think what are the approaches that would improve overall environmental health as well as human health in these particular neighborhoods. So this is getting at the neighborhood scale with some of this work, because we know, again, from the previous work, what neighborhoods might be experiencing some of the most acute impacts. Here's an example of this isn't Portland. This is actually a really great project I'm very excited about in Jackson, Mississippi, which is a very, very poor city and has extensive impacts from heat. And we're really exploring on a historically African-American Black neighborhood, which has really been lost a lot of economic prosperity that it had for decades. In the last several years, it's really lost that. So we're thinking about how do we bring economic kind of messaging, engagement, and programming into various forms of cooling this neighborhood. And so it's been a really exciting project, and we're working on this for a couple of years. And then one last, it's not Portland, but nevertheless, it's still a national concern. In Los Angeles, we're trying to do a lot more kind of context and background setting of what is it you can do in a space that has specific history, that has specific policy and programs. What are the kind of strategies that you can think of in this stretch of road or corridor that might be really relevant to that place? And so I'll just kind of leave it at that and close out by basically saying that this all began for us with understanding like what is the distribution of heat in a city back in 2008. And this was through a National Science Foundation grant where we put these sensors on cars and bicycles and rode around city of Portland, collecting tens of thousands of measurements, very highly granular measurements, like the map I showed you at the very beginning. And this allows us then to really think about exposure and who's getting exposed in what locations. And I'm really excited that this program has just blown up. The National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration took it, and now we've done this in over 80 cities across the world. This year we're doing another 14 cities, including Santiago, Chile. And so it's really been an extraordinary way to bring community groups together to talk about heat. And when we talk about communication systems, this is really a mechanism to be able to socialize the concept a bit more and get people on board with what's happening. So I would propose that Jonna and I come to the Netherlands in 2024 and try to think about a G4 Netherlands cities campaign. And we've been long talking about it. And so we're waiting for our invitation, and we'll look forward to that in the chance that next year will pose some opportunity to do it. Oh no, I'll just close out by saying the work ahead is really that we're in a, I've been working on this for some time here, a couple of books that colleagues and I have written about urban heat and trying to think about equity as a central spine through this work, because we know who gets hit first and worst in these climate disasters. So we're in a moment of transformation. We know that building these non-traditional partnerships is going to really be essential. How do we center those that are going to be most vulnerable? And then let's base our decisions on our emerging understanding through using data, through using lived experience of place and contextualizing those interventions that might actually be effective. So with that, I'll just leave some contact information and close out here. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and waiting for our invitation to come in person so that we don't have any technology issues or timing challenges on my end.
You can have an early sleep. Thank you so much, Vivek.
Sure.
Very rich and very helpful for a conversation. And I wish we had another hour. We're already totally out of hand when it comes to time, but because we're working quite in a similar way in the Netherlands by now, with the government of internal affairs and with 10 cities by now to test, as we call it, the health housing habitat multiple layer approach to heat risk reduction. And we're doing similar mapping in a national research, and this is the third final year. And Patrick Klaas, who intervened earlier, is also part with me and some others of the group to support it. Is to put 3 layers of data at neighborhood level in combination, and we're close to the kind of heat label for specific types of housing. So you can scale up and give them a heat label, whether it's A or G or whatever. So you that gives a range where the risk is, the vulnerability or the fragility index of the inhabitants of an area, which is very helpful. And of course, the heat maps that we know, combined with socioeconomic data from a neighborhood. So we have far more data to really focus where we, as you say, we know it from looking at it, but then it's far more covered by data that the poorest neighborhoods are the most vulnerable to heat risks and to other risks in society in general. So we're eager to follow up on your invitation to invite you. That's great. And to continue this conversation, maybe online also a few times with other research groups in the Netherlands or maybe Europe, to share data and share notes, so we can really speed up this process, which is really in line with with our thinking on vulnerability and social inequity as being one of the key factors for heat risks. Questions to Vivek, because I see a lot of discussion going on air codes, which doesn't come totally as a surprise. It's a hot issue topic in the Netherlands. I remember when I started working on heat 20 years ago, I remember WWF asked, we're not anyway going to support air codes. And then I said, well, there comes a day that you have to. So the debate is shifting and also getting far more specific in the details in what is an acceptable and what are other alternatives for air codes and what is acceptable when it comes to reducing health risk for vulnerable people. So this discussion really, I think, contributes to that discussion. Other questions to Vivek? Let me see. Who likes to? Richard Delaroy. Would you like to pose your question yourself?
Very nice presentation, Vivek. A lot of knowledge is there. I believe we can learn a lot. But I was thinking about personal cooling in general, because if you bring people together, it's also bringing heat together. But how much space a person needs for cooling down? Have you an opinion about that?
Well, so this comes up with personal, like individual health concerns in terms of space and cooling. And if you bring people together, it might increase, if I understand the question, it might increase temperatures, and that might in and of itself create some kind of hazard, health hazard. So my general sense on that is much of the physiological response to heat is very individualized. There are collective responses in general populations, and population health research would underscore that, the older adults, adults, those with pre-existing health conditions, etc. Though in terms of the amount of space, it really matters. Several environmental factors matter. So first is how much movement of air is there in that space. So if you're assuming in an enclosed environment, if you're moving a lot of air, the distance between people can be less, right? It's like buildings in a city. If there's a lot of movement of air, you can actually cool that a neighborhood or that city a lot. But often we build these buildings on the waterfront where there's a lot of water or a lot of cool air that can come off of that differences in pressure and come into land, which then cools. So my guess is that it really has a lot to do with individual health and kind of physiological conditions, as well as kind of the mental health of that individual. The other really comes down to the movement, the environmental conditions, which is movement of air is a big one. Generally in the cooling centers and cooling kind of stations that I've seen indoor, there is a set. In the pandemic, it was 6 feet. And I think we've kind of maintained that throughout this time, because the pandemic was driving more of the distance requirements than necessarily the kind of physiological realities of heating up a space. Most of these places have very high roofs also, so the lower areas tend to be much cooler as well. So just the structure might matter quite a bit as well. So yeah, it's an interesting question, but very, very nuanced in terms of the immediate impact and exposure.
Thank you. One of the things I can add, and my colleague already put it on the chat, is that we are focusing on Churches Day, actually a campaign that is aimed to have more standards for how to cool and not to cool too much. And for the Dutch viewers, we zijn natuurlijk ook van Warme Truiendag. We have a warm Spencer Day in the winter to make, and the slogan is cool your body, not your room, or not your house, and not the world. And the opposite of warm your body and not the world. And the opposite is true as well, cool your body. So to focus more also by the air codes cool the room, are there other measures to cool the body? So cooling vest is also something that we have into picture. But as I said, it's a whole new area to develop it, to share notes and experience and underlying data about. Thank you so much. And God, this gives appetite for more discussions and more exchange of notes and experience also with others. But I'd like to give the floor to Laurens Hondema of the GGD in Amsterdam. And it's the first city to really do the exercise on we call it not extreme heat, we call it Code Red, to put it into kind of shaping of the kind of codes that the weather services give for extreme weather events. And we put the extreme heat risk into Code Red, which we haven't yet experienced in the Netherlands, but your lessons is the great stimulus for us to start preparing for it. So Laurens, can I give you the floor to tell us how we work on this in our small, as we call it, our small wet frog country. This is the image that people like to talk about in the Netherlands. And they feel it hard to let go of that image and to prepare for hotter conditions. Laurens, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madeleine. I hope everybody can hear me well. As you can see on the slide, Code Red is also an example of the color of our city. And the Amsterdam logo is in red, and also is our house style of the slides. Because we've already spent quite some time in this webinar, I will keep it a bit shorter than I thought before. I am working at the Municipal Health Service in Amsterdam, and I'm an expert in environmental health, but also a crisis advisor. And I would like to share my view on this Code Red scenario, this scenario with extreme heat from a crisis point of view. So I'll go a bit quicker through these slides. You all know that the temperature in our global mean temperature is rising, but I do want to point out the next slide that it might be going faster than we think. In the coming years, there will probably an El Nino, and we might even hit the 1.5 mark earlier. So I think I would want to just share this with you guys because I was pretty overwhelmed by this message. The next slide. And also in the Netherlands, high temperatures are a problem. In 2019, we broke the record of 40 degrees Celsius. And that was when it caught my attention. Next slide. Because I knew about this extreme heat wave events. This is a picture from the Chicago heat wave. There's an interesting book written about it, which I can recommend to everybody. And this really made me think about what would happen in the Netherlands if we would have a heat wave like this. And next slide. That's why I went to the Dutch Weather Institute and asked them about what are the chances for this very extreme heat or these extreme temperatures in Amsterdam. And they made a nice calculation about the return period of several scenarios with temperatures. So you can see here in this graph on the horizontal axis the return period, and all the colored dots, they represent temperatures. So if you look at, for instance, a temperature around 30 degrees, that will happen once every year. So that's a normal temperature. And they did that for 1900, and for the present time, as you can see, it shifts up. So there's a smaller return period for higher temperatures, but you also see that it will probably be around 36 max. But in the future, 40 degrees might be relevant for the Netherlands. So this gives some validation to preparing for that kind of scenario. Next slide. And there's a problem with that, because with those calculations, you have only used the data of what happened. So you use a lot of data. You don't use all the data, because every day we make predictions about temperatures that can happen. And there's always temperatures that did not happen. And these are events which can have higher temperatures than actually were happening. And a scientist made a calculation about how high the risk was that you see a lot higher temperatures than you would have expected. And on this map of the world, you see that the Netherlands is in an area where the chance that this happens is pretty high. Next slide. And this model was used to calculate what kind of temperatures could have happened in the Netherlands. And you see that the temperature is even higher than the temperatures I showed before. So this is based on a bigger data set, and shows that it could be in an unseen event that it could be even 42 degrees in Amsterdam. So it's a bit technical. I have to explain it pretty fast, but this also shows that very high temperatures could happen in the future in Amsterdam. Next slide. And that is very difficult to interpret it, because as we don't know exactly what is the chance for these extreme temperatures, I also don't know exactly the effect, what will happen when that temperature is in the Netherlands. So here you see a graph on the relative mortality risk in Amsterdam for several temperatures. And you see on the right side that when the temperature rises, the relative risk for mortality increases. But also, you can also see that there's no data available for temperatures from 30 degrees and up. And we could extrapolate, of course, and that's pretty tricky because you see that the confidence interval is getting wider, so the insecurities are growing also. But yeah, I think you can imagine that with the information from Portland and other extreme heat waves, that you can expect a very high relative risk ratio of mortality risk. Next slide. So this with this images in my head, this is also from Chicago, where there were a lot of lethal casualties. I went to my colleagues from the municipality. Next slide. And talked about what can we do. And here you see a very brief summary of what Madeleine Helmer has tried to write down with some experts on the heat waves, as she already produced some outlines of what could be a Code Red heat wave strategy. And in that strategy, she emphasized on the increased urgency. So you're not talking anymore about vulnerability, but you say you are really now in danger. And she has written down some specific calls to action, and that's written down from a few to vulnerable people, but also to volunteers, what they can do for actions. And so we did that with experts. We gathered some information, and I did it in Amsterdam the other way around. So if you can go to the next slide, because we have this mind map, which is produced by the University of Amsterdam, and it shows all the different themes that have something to do with heat stress. And I invited stakeholders from these various themes and discussed with them about what could happen during extreme heat, for extreme temperatures. And I think this is something you should do in every city where you want to prepare for extreme heat waves. Not just to get together the things that could happen, because I think we learn more and more about it also through webinars like this, but also to involve people. And can I have the next slide, please? Well, this is a mind map we created with the Climate Adaptation Service organization in the Netherlands. And here we wrote down the effects we expect from an extreme heat wave. So these are pictures you can use when you talk with several stakeholders and discuss about what could happen in your city and what you could do about it. And as you can see, in all the themes, things are more extreme, but there can also be new things. So one of the things we were discussing about were, is there enough people available who work in critical sectors, like emergency responders. And we were also discussing, could there be happening things you would not expect? And we call those the unseen events in an unseen heat event. And that's why I think it's very important to also, when such extreme heat happens, that you also evaluate it very well. Can I have the next slide? And that's where I go into the chain of security actions. We use this model, which you see here on the right of the slide, to prepare for a crisis and incidents. So, for instance, a chemical that spills on the road, and you have to respond to that. We train on that in our crisis response system, and we use this systematic overview to prepare for that. And I think it can be useful also to prepare for a heat wave. Because I think a normal heat wave, you could say that, this is just regular care. So regular care for people who are homeless, or regular care for people who are experiencing problems with the heat. There's a healthcare system, and healthcare systems should help them. But in case of this extreme heat waves, I think it's really necessary to use a crisis approach. And on the right, you can see the several phases. You can use the proactive measures to influence the risk in the beginning. So that means the environment. You can plant more trees. Then there's the phase of prevention. And here you could think about things like informing people on what they can do during a heat wave. And then there's the preparation. So where you practice as crisis first responders to this kind of disaster. And then there's the actual response itself. And there it can be very useful to use the people from crisis management in the Netherlands, because there's a clear method of a coordinated approach. So it's clear who does what and who decides, and you get some extra capacity. But as you can see, there's more actions in this chain. So it's important to, I think it's very useful to use this model so you can prepare on all those points. Next slide. And then just short on the weather cuts, because in the Netherlands we are preparing for a Code Red, and that's because the Weather Institute uses these several codes to warn the public about the risk of weather phenomenon. And I think there's a slight problem at the moment with the Code Red naming for the heat waves. And if you can go to the next slide, here you see an example of the codes being used for a storm. And you can see that when there's exactly so many kilometers or force of storm, you can give it a certain color, because that will always give a certain risk. You can imagine if there's a very hard storm, trees will fall from above 10 Beauforts. But with temperature, that will be a bit more challenging, because the earlier the heat wave starts, the more risk it gives. So it will be, I think, challenging to find a threshold where you will use the code. And also, where will you give a Code Red? Will you do that for a specific area and very local, depending on the different risks, or will you give it for a whole country? What will be more easier to understand for people? It's also something we need to think about. And there should also be really clear actions that are different from a Code Orange or a Code Red, because at the moment the Weather Institute does not give different actions for people. They don't advise different. And the problem is, in the very basic action plan we have, we advise a lot on drinking enough water and other advice. But you cannot say you should drink more water. The advice doesn't get better with a Code Red. So therefore, I think it's very important, as I said earlier, to have conversations about what extra actions can we prepare and who does what. And that's something we need to talk about in the Netherlands. And then I hope we can develop a Code Red in time before this heat wave will strike us. Next slide. Yeah, then I will thank you for your attention. And just a slight suggestion of changing the narrative from climate change to climate crisis. So I will try to not use that word anymore.
Thank you very much, Laurens. In the meantime, while you had this very interesting presentation and helping us also for the Dutch discussion to fine-tune the subjects that need to be discussed in Code Red, there has been a lot of exchange, and thank you, Vivek, for all your input in the chat for articles and issues we can call upon. Is there any specific question to Laurens? I don't see it in the chat, but maybe someone has it, and you can then raise your hands, because that's the fastest way. I do have a question, Laurens. Where are you in the Amsterdam planning? How because we work together at the national context to set a kind of framework for a Code Red plan. How can you tell a little bit more how it works in Amsterdam? Are there open ears for it, or people don't really as an urgency? Or
yeah, well, I've got my colleagues from the crisis response. I see them a lot and I work on it, but it's very in the part of the crisis system that I showed. It's very much on the training side. It's more difficult to really get a heatwave plan on paper with actual actions that people are doing. So the things Jonna told about is that they're really creating cooling stations. We're not yet there, but we are going to have talks with the municipality about that in a short time, and I hope that will give it a boost. But if I'm honestly, I think we really have to wait for a extreme heat wave event before the things will really go faster. Because for us it is a rainy green country at the moment. And there's going a lot of attention to heat waves during the summer, but after the summer, it's very difficult to get things done.
But that we know, and we prepare for that. So that's the lesson from crisis management. Be ready with your plans for when the crisis comes, and then you can move faster afterwards.
Yeah, and also never waste a good crisis. So we are already preparing a lot, and we have this network now in the Netherlands. And I think at the moment when there's a real heat wave, we can respond to it, of course, but we can also use that momentum to increase the activities on preventing heat deaths.
Caroline has a question for you. Caroline, can you raise it yourself?
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation. I was wondering, do you think there are any type of sort of research that could really help raise this awareness? Or from your perspective in Amsterdam in particular, is there any sort of evidence that is missing or that would be useful in your work to say, oh, look, we find this and that?
Well, this is an excellent question, because this is what I wanted to ask Jonna and Vivek as well, because we talk a lot about interventions. And what I think is difficult is to see how effective these interventions are. So we've got the cooling stations, the misting, we got talks to people. What is the most effective? What should we start with, and how do we proportionate these kind of interventions? So I would like to know to get more information on that, but also simple data like morbidity data of the impact of heat waves, because I was really surprised by the slide of the increase of emergency room visits. Because that's very clear evidence that there's a medical problem as well, and that at the moment we don't have the data yet in the Netherlands, and also not at the local level. So yeah, that's really missing.
I also like to invite Bernard Hagens, who's the national coordinator of our heat plan from the National Institute of Health and Environment, maybe to pop in on this, because we've been working on it for a number of years. How do you measure evidence of the efficiency of heat plants? But maybe first, Jonna, you can answer Lauren's question, and maybe then Werner would like to chip in.
Oh, no, I don't have an answer. I'm just interested in where I feel like we haven't done enough to look at excess deaths. Because we look to the medical examiner to tell us when someone died of hypothermia, but that's like, there's so many confounding factors in that.
Yeah.
The excess death data maybe is easier to get at for both of us, and I also think it better portrays the scope of the problem. I don't know. I would love for us to both maybe collect that and compare it in future.
Werner, maybe you can add how you, from the national coordination perspective, look at the evidence of the interventions of the national heat plan. How do we measure it or get a feel for it? Maybe you can put on open your microphone. We don't hear you.
Do you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Throw it away. Well, you can look at it a few different ways. One way is, does the information from the institute goes through other people, and do they know about the heat, and did the communication go all right? So that's how you can evaluate. But you can also look at are there less people excess dying or other things, and from what we are going to do now is we are going to look at all statistical data before there was a heatwave plan, and after there's a heatwave plan, and did the intervention creating a heatwave plan, did that really help? So we are looking at that right now. People from the RIVM in a special in a project, they're looking at it. But we're also going to look at on another way, and that's from all people that died during the heat. So that they call it a single case study. So you only collect the people who are already who died, and then you're going to look at what are the different how do you call it, backgrounds of it, and try to look at more detail about that. So there are a few ways how we're going to look at it right now.
Okay, thank you. But not yet a specific research on the effectiveness of the interventions of the National Heat Plan.
The first one I said, you have a period before a heatwave plan and after a heatwave plan, but then you have to also take in account that it's much more known during the last 15 years that heat is a risk. So are you looking only at the heatwave plan, or are you looking at the whole society which changed about thinking about heat?
Yeah, it will be difficult. Gosh, this is against all rules for a long webinar. It should have been far shorter, but it was so interesting to have this discussion. And in the chat, in the conversation, in the presentations, we have a long list, a long agenda to work on for the next year, for when you come to Europe. And you can imagine, I mean, in the meantime, we're thinking of all kind of things, what would make your visit worthwhile to come our way. Jonna and Vivek, and Laurens, I would like to thank you so much, I think, on behalf of all of us and on behalf of everyone who's been working on heat, because again, like last year, it's stimulating our thinking. It's very thought-provocative in the detail and in the larger picture. So thank you for the wealth of your interventions, and thank the audience for your questions and all the links that you've been working and sending to us. This will be continued. And I've learned a new mate, Vivek, from your comment. We have now climates. We are climates. So let's keep that in the language, and looking forward to see you soon, very soon. And maybe you can hang a little bit so I can thank you personally when everybody else has gone for our dinner. Thank you again. We will have a next public webinar on the 8th of June. And this is about the menukaart Hitte, the menu heat that we're developing with the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the pilot with 10 municipalities on this experiment. Looking forward. Thank you so much.